Good evening and good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. And welcome to the ordinary session about financialization, dual economies, and endogenous cycles of the third edition of the International Workshop about Structural Development Microeconomics. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Daniel Feliciano Cruz from the University of the Basque Country, and today I will be the judge during this session. 4 works will be presented today. We have more than 1 hour and a half. That is enough time, but I would suggest limiting the presentations to around 15 minutes. I will warn the presenters 2 minutes before finishing that time. And questions can be asked through the chat box of YouTube and will be answered at the end of each presentation. And so if there are any other questions about the session, we can start with the first presentation presented by myself. Entitled Development of Finance or Financialization, Economic Methodology as a Source of Theoretical and Policy Divergences. And I would like to start this presentation showing the following graph, in which we can see how the number of publications using the term financialization or similar concepts has gradually increased over the last 20 years. In particular, after the financial crisis of 2008, what proves the popularity of the term. However, despite this popularity and the existence of some general descriptions of the process, like the one given by Gerald Epstein, the truth is that there is no analytical, sharp definition or clear definition about the concept, as there are multiple views. Authors like Stockhammer consider that these differences are mainly due to the inherent contradictory economic reality. However, and without neglecting this position, the aim of this paper is to prove that first, the different understandings on financialization are mainly due to the different methodological backgrounds of each of the school of thought. And second, that these divergences are not only relevant for the academic sphere, but have practical implications for economic policies. To this end, we will follow the following empirical strategy. The following strategy. First, we identify the main methodological foundations of each school of thought related to the topic. Then we link this methodological background to the financialization view of each of the schools, and consequently to the economic effects alluded, like for example on capital accumulation, income distribution, economic growth, etc. Finally, based on these effects, we explain what are the policy prescriptions or policy proposals proposed by each school of thought to deal with these effects. For example, in the case of neoclassical economics, the unifying principle is the Cartesian Euclidean thought, by which all economic propositions have to be derived from a series of actions by deduction. In our case, the main one is the agent's optimization behavior, and conclusions must be specified in relation to an historic equilibrium. These properties made these authors can therefore have an historical view of financialization as a new stage of capitalism, but as an expansion of financial activity necessarily explained by the optimization behavior and the benefits of the financial services that justify the increase of their demand. In this sense, it is considered that financial services help to reduce cost of information and transaction, promoting capital accumulation and innovation and therefore economic growth. Within this framework, the only negative effect of the growth of the financials or of an excessive growth of the financial sector might be linked to some kind of market failure like asymmetric information. Therefore, the policy prescription of neoclassical is focused on deregulating the financial system to promote the positive effects of the financial services, with the exception of if there is any kind of market imperfection, like for example asymmetric information or adverse selection, that would justify the intervention of the state. On the other hand, we have heterodox authors, like for example post-Keynesians or Marxists. These authors start their analysis using the Babylonian model thought and with realistic assumptions, what made them or enable them to have an historical view of financialization. In the case of the Marxist school, they start their analysis based on the labor theory of value, the class struggle, historical materialism, the focus on the forces and relations of production. So they conceive financialization as a stage of capitalism related to some kind of alteration of the forces and relations of production in modern economies. However, there are multiple views within the Marxist school. Some relate these changes, for example, to globalization, and understanding the growth of finance as a tool to discipline the accumulation process in a globalized production. Others relate the financialization to the economic stagnation of economies, since the limits to profitability in productive investment would promote capitalists to invest even more in financial markets, financial assets, and financial products. And others are more focused on the financial sector, talking about concepts like financial expropriation, the financial expropriation of surplus from families through commissions or interest payments, or the role of the interest-bearing capital in more areas of economy. Regarding economic policies, Marxists have always doubts about the potentials of the economic policy, and in this case it's not the exception, and they consider government as part of the historical process, and they prefer solutions related to the workers' political action. Finally, regarding the post-Keynesians, these authors start their analysis based on the conception of a monetized economies, on the principle of effective demand, the relevance of institutions, power, distributions, and all this, even if they also have a historical view of financialization like Marxists, they consider this stage of capitalism characterized by different institutional transformations linked to the growth of finance. They usually locate the origins of financialization in the deregulation of the financial system that promoted the appearance of new financial practices, actors, or instruments. For example, they talk about a revolution in the corporate governance of non-financial corporations thanks to new instruments like stock options or hostile takeovers facilitated by young bonds, and that would have changed the relations of powers within firms. Shareholders would have gained much more power in comparison to other groups, and prioritize short-term profits in comparison to other goals like the growth of the firm. All this institutional transformation will lead to a fall in the productive investment and to a higher inequality, would have depressing effects in demands on the economy. To compensate these effects, post-Keynesians propose that the financialist economy might temporarily compensate these effects with debt finance consumption or wealth finance consumption, but only temporarily, until the credit bubble bursts. Therefore, focusing on these problems, post-Keynesians usually tend to propose policies to reverse the bad effects of financialization, like the regulation of the financial system, or low long-term interest rates, the use of palliative policy income reforms, or the use of fiscal policies to compensate the depressing effects on demand generated by financialization. To conclude, we can summarize the work with three key ideas. First, that the different approaches, methodological approaches used are the cause of the different understandings of financialization, that these different understandings make authors conceive different implications or economic implications of financialization, and these different implications may then propose different economic policies. Finally, it must be noted that this lack of consensus might be positive, and it depends on the degree of communication, exchange of idea, or reaction among a school of thought. Especially if there isn't a simple rejection between views, but some kind of exercise of containment, accepted paradox, or even synthesis between the schools when analyzing financialization. Thank you very much, and I'm open to any other question. If there isn't any other question about the presentation, we can start with the following presentation. Paulo, are you?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Let me share the
So let's start with the next presentation entitled Real Financial Market Interaction in Dual Economies, and presented by Paulo Medeiros from the University of Siena. I will tell you, it's like before finishing in 2 minutes, I will tell you.
Okay. Just a sec. Okay. Can you see the slides? Let me know if I can start. Okay. So it's a different name now. I made some changes after visiting some different congress. This is one of the chapter of my PhD thesis, Business Cycles, Dual Economies, and Real Financial Market Interactions. On that paper, I'm trying to explore some dynamics regarding real and financial markets at the same time. It's a common topic in economics, especially after 2008, right? And we see it's after the 28 crisis, we have a lot of new papers regarding that kind of interaction, like on the mainstream and also in alternative views. And I'm basing that paper on recent results that challenge the view of pure exogenous cycles on the economies. And so we try to use alternative models with endogenous dynamics. There's a lot of authors working on this right now, and I'll try to get on the way. But I wasn't able to find any paper giving some special attention to informal economies. So that's the main motivation. We have also evidence supporting the link between a large informal sector and macroeconomic outcomes, in the sense that some economies with a large informal sector may present difference from central economies. And at the same time, so you have that formal informal sector works together in the business cycle, and with some difference we explore in the paper. And also firms in the formal sector are usually restricted from access the credit market. Some interesting facts on informality. It's the fact that we usually talking about a sector that operates with shallow productivity, low skilled workers, and limited or even no access to credit markets. So 8 of the 15 countries with the largest GDP has at least 20% of the output produced by the informal sector. This shows us how important it is to start to understand the impacts of the informal sector, especially because it counts to that 20%. But in the future, probably this percentage will go up even more. So this is the informal output share for the top 15 global economies. As you can see, you have a larger of countries with a higher participation of the informal sector on the output. So to study this, I developed a discrete model in 3 dimensions. I have a financial sector composed by liquidity and solvency equation, and a real sector with an output equation. So the formal and informal firms are indexed by F&I, and also I have extrapolative and regressive expectations also indexed. So I have a switch mechanism, the spirit of Minsky and McFadden, to account for the transition between the both formal and informal firms, the extrapolative and regressive expectations, and my demand is induced by a production via hyperbolic tangent production specification. This is a general overview of the model in the sense that, okay, for a given level of the output, I have an income effect that affects excess demand. The output also affects the liquidity in the form of cash flow for firms. The liquidity is connected with the solvency of the firms, also given some expectation parameters. You have the wealth effect affect the excess demand. Production is guided by that excess demand with a given range of production, so we will have the output again. So this is the flow where the model is working right now. These are some key equations for the financial side. For example, I have the expected solvency that will show that the solvency for the formal sector will be equal the expected liquidity in the future. But for the informal sector, it's just the liquidity today, given the fact the informal sector has no access to the credit markets. The expected liquidity, on the other hand, is defined by the way that the agents will behave as a fundamentalist, or is also as a chartist, in the way the fundamentalists expect the economy to go back to the fundamentals in some kind of pessimist view. The chartists are the optimistic and extrapolate the trend. So we have that kind of switch mechanism. I mentioned it before, that trades between the both expectation and formation process. On the real side, I have this demand equation that can be written in the function of the solvency and the output for both sectors. So regarding the production specification, we have this excess demand that will drive the decision, in the sense that if the excess demand is positive, firms will produce more and vice versa, right? So this is after some parameterization, simply and simplified forms. This is the simplified version of the dynamic system. This is the 3 equations: the equation for liquidity, solvency, and output. This is the demand equation, and the beta captures the expectations. This is the proposition regarding the equilibrium of the system. You can see, if you have interest, you can see the paper, and also the stability conditions. Important thing to say here is the fact that if you violate condition 1, a flip bifurcation may occur, and for the condition 2, a Neymark-Sacker bifurcation, in the sense that you have instability in the system. We can have endogenous fluctuations. This is the behavior of the liquidity and solvency in a bifurcation diagram, in the sense that when we increase the parameter lambda that represents the share of the formal sector in the economy, we can see that the liquidity and the solvency will start to present endogenous fluctuation after, in that example, closer to 0.5. And not only this, but you have different behavior regarding the size of the fluctuation. So beyond here, probably the economy may display some problems regarding to liquidity mismatch between the solvency and the liquidity. Here we have the behavior of the output in the same situation. And we can see that, for example, when we increase the values of lambda, you have an increase in the equilibrium output. But after some threshold, we have the appearance of endogenous instability, endogenous fluctuations. This shows you some kind of trade-off between the presence of the formal sector. If you have more formal sector, you have more instability, but an output higher. So I made some synthetic time series in the sense that we can take a look how the model will behave given some calibration of the model for two different kind of countries. And regarding the expectation parameters, I'll use the same for both countries. This is a time series for Brazil. Not look like, but this is we're looking at two different series for a super small change in the initial condition. We can see, for example, that we can only see one series. That's because the series are completely equal, right? So the message here is we have endogenous fluctuations, but at the same time, the series are not sensitive to initial conditions. After some time, the series starts to behave like the same. And the opposite is not true when we go to the United States case, when we have some minor change in the initial condition after 2000 periods, like excluded for this graph, we have endogenous fluctuation also, but we have sensitive to initial condition, and the series start to behave completely different. This is a indication that we may have chaotic dynamics in the model. As we can see, if we plot it on a 3D that equals the three time series, we can see a behavior that remembers a chaotic kind of motion. So this probably is connected to the fact that we have a chaotic attractor. So in that sense, maybe some kind difficult to understand what the next movements of the time series. So for policy implications, it must be interesting to know that maybe the policy won't have the effect you're expecting given the chaotic behavior of the time series. So as the results suggest, we have different results for United States and Brazil calibration. If the United States economy with larger formal sector, you have more instability with a presence of chaotic attractor. And in economies with high informality, such as Brazil, probably the lack of external funding decreases instability from the expectations channel, given the fact that firms are operating only with the cash from today to fulfill the solvency obligations. And the output volatility does not necessarily translate into qualitative changes. I say that because the United States, the Brazilian series has initial output more volatile than the United States, but in some situation, this not necessarily will become a qualitative change in the series. Not necessarily it will become a chaotic behavior. So just look at the volatility of output of a time series. It's not a sufficient condition to say something about a change of qualitative behavior. To conclude, I constructed that dynamical model trying to capture real financial market interactions with two sources of heterogeneity: the church's fundamentalist expectations on the financial sector and the formal informal sector on the real dimension. We saw that the model is consistent with flip and emergent cycle bifurcation and can lead to persistent fluctuations and complex dynamics. The numerical experiments shows that greater instability can follow economy with more significant formal sector. And for the next step, I'm thinking about the interaction of the deterministic skeleton of this model with the stochastic shocks to see the general behavior of it, and also the employment dynamics and how can I use sectoral endogenous sectoral composition to see what happens when you have some change between the share of the formal and informal sector or the share of the production at a given moment of the business cycle. And that's it. Thank you very much.
I don't know if. Let me see if there is any other question in the chat box in YouTube. No. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure for me.
Thank you very much. And if there is any other question, we can start with the next presentation of John Cajas Guijarro. Entitled Two Dynamic Models of Distributive and Financial Endogenous Cycles. So,
Okay.
John, are you ready?
Yes, just a second. Just a second. I want to share my presentation.
No problem. We are not hurry, so don't worry. There is no problem.
Thank you. Okay. So I don't know what's the here. Okay, so please tell me if you can see my slides. Okay, you can see my my slides, my screen. Well, I guess yes. Thank you. Okay, so what I will present in this. Sorry, I want to take the time. Okay, sorry. Well, what I want to present you in this presentation is a proposal of two dynamical models of distributive and financial endogenous cycles. The idea of this model is that, well, as we have seen also in the presentation of Paulo, we know that economic fluctuations in capitalism are complex, and also we know that there are a lot of interactions between the real sector and the financial sector. But also I want to emphasize that there are other interactions. For instance, we may have interactions between this distributive cycle associated with the struggle between capitalists and workers when defined on the distribution process, and financial cycles, of course, associated with, for instance, the dynamics of debt and also the dynamics of the interest rate and so on. There is a strand of literature that tries to understand the interaction between these two processes, the distributive and the financial cycles, through high-dimensional dynamical systems that try to combine insights from the model of endogenous cycles of Goodwin and some ideas from Minsky and his proposal of the financial instability. Maybe the most relevant work on this literature, or well, the seminal work on this literature, is the paper from Steve Keen in 1895, and some updates of the paper, particularly the 2020 version, where Keen tries to present how the combination of the Goodwin model with Minskian ideas may be able to generate endogenous cycles and also complex dynamics. So, in this sense, the work I will present now is fits in this literature by trying to present two theoretical models. First, I present a model that I will call Model A. This Model A considers a situation where aggregate investment equals aggregate savings. But also, I will assume that there is some kind of delay between the time capitalists save their income and the moment they distribute the income to firms for investment. So there is some kind of delay, and this delay will lead firms to demand credit from a renter class in order to sustain their cash flows. Then I will extend the model by proposing a new model called Model B, and Model B will accept the idea that, well, this equality between investment and savings does not seem to be a clear situation where we can understand debt. So instead, Model B extends the model by including an investment function, and also it lets the chance to have non-zero excess demand and the economic effects of the non-zero excess demand. Okay, so we will, in the paper, we study the analytical properties of the model, and also we present some numerical simulations, and in particular, we identify the existence of some limit cycles, and also we identify the pattern that these limit cycles are highly influenced by the distribution of the bargaining power between workers and capitalists, as well as the behavior of the central bank and the renter class. And finally, from these models, we will try to present a preliminary proposal of how we can identify different financing regimes in the sense proposed originally by Minsky. Okay, so I will go on with the assumptions of Model A. We have a closed economy without government. We have three social classes, capitalists, workers, and renters. And also we have a central bank. There is only one good that can be used for consumption or investment. There is capital only in the form of fixed capital and without depreciation. We assume that prices are defined by adding a markup to the primary costs in the tradition of Galeski. Also, we assume in Model A that, well, we have savings equal investment, so there is no excess demand. But also, we assume that there is a time lag between the moment capitalists receive their income and save it and the moment capitalists decide to distribute this income to firms for investment. So this time lag leads firms to seek credit from a renter class. So the renter class borrows money to facilitate liquidity, but they also charge an interest rate. Also, we assume that credit allows firms to sustain their economic activities. Okay, we have another assumptions. These are simple models, well, kind of simple models. So we assume that workers and renters do not save. We assume also that employment and inflation accelerate the money wage. In this sense, we use an extended Phillips curve in the tradition of Goodwin, but also in the tradition of the Say. The Say present a model of cycles in the tradition of Goodwin, but with an extended Phillips curve that considers exactly the same thing, employment and inflation accelerating the money wage. Also, we assume that labor productivity and labor supply grow at constant rates. Firms adjust the price level when the actual markup they get differ from a desired markup. So I take this idea from the work of Dutt in the sense that, well, of course, prices are defined by a markup. However, the desired markup that firms imposes for prices not necessarily is the same that their desired markup because in the market, when you have fluctuations, prices also can fluctuate as an effect of the fluctuation of the wage. And also this is an idea coming in particularly from Meireles and Lima. We assume that all the time there is a cash flow identity where net profits and net borrowing equals funds employed for investment and debt service. The idea is that firms will always have this identity to be verified in order to have their economic activity to evolve in normal terms. So they require liquidity, and they get liquidity from net profits, from capitalists, but also by new borrowing. And also we will assume that there is a central bank, as I told you before, and this central bank will operate by trying to achieve a specific inflation rate. And to do that, to achieve a specific inflation rate, the central bank we will assume that has the authority to adjust the general level of the interest rates through monetary policy. And in particular, monetary policy will affect the behavior of the renter class. Okay, so this is the model. I will not get into the detail of the equations, but at least I want to tell you some two details. First of all, this model resembles the structure of the classical and post-Keynesian models, in particular the model of Steve Keen, in the sense that we assume an aggregate economy with imperfect competition, where we have a Phillips curve that defines the money wage, and at the end we arrive with a four-dimensional dynamical system in continuous time for the state variables, for these four state variables: the employment rate, the markup, the leverage ratio, that is the ratio between debt and stock of capital, and the interest rate. Of course, this model has the limitation that we are assuming a macroeconomic equilibrium between savings and investment, but this will be solved with Model B. In any case, for this model, we can find a non-trivial equilibrium point in the steady state. So this is the equilibrium point, non-trivial. And this equilibrium is positive when we achieve some conditions that are, well, not problematic. But the most important thing, when we analyze this four-dimensional system, the Jacobian matrix of the system, we find that the system has a locally stable equilibrium point. When the reaction of the central bank to the inflation gap, that is the difference between the actual inflation and the inflation target, satisfy the following condition. I don't want to get into the detail of the equation, but at least the idea. When the central bank has a low reaction to the inflation gap, then we achieve stability. That's the first peculiar result. And another peculiar result is that when we apply the Hubbard bifurcation theorem for four-dimensional dynamical systems, we arrive to the conclusion that when M, the reaction of the central bank to the inflation gap, gets closer to MHB, that is a critical value, we analytically prove that the model tends to exhibit limit cycles, the stable limit cycles near the equilibrium. So, well, this is the proof. I don't want to get into the details. Instead, I present you some numerical simulations of the model, where you can see that after some initial conditions, the model is able to generate stable cycles when we compare these state variables, for instance, in two-dimensional parameter graphs. So you can see these cycles. In particular, we get some cycles that resemble the clockwise dynamics or similar to the clockwise dynamics presented by Goodwin. And also we find cycles for the leverage ratio and for interest rate on some of them. And well, this is the case of limit cycles when M is close to the critical value. And also we can find some kind of unstable cycles when M becomes bigger than the critical value. That is when the central bank has a stronger reaction to the inflationary gap. And we find damped oscillations, stable spirals, when the reaction of the central bank is lower than the critical value. In addition to these simulations, we find some relevant patterns. For instance, we can find when the central bank is less restricted to control inflation without exacerbating the volatility of cycle. That is, some cases when MHB increases. Remember that MHB is this threshold. So when the threshold becomes higher, the central bank has more space to control inflation. So these are some of the parameters that we can change and keep or gain some space to control inflation. And also we get another parameters that constrain or poses higher limits to the central bank to control inflation. So here we have some numerical simulations to understand the effect of each parameter on the reaction of the central bank. And well, in particular, I want to highlight just one result, and that is that when we try these numerical simulations, we find that an increase in the parameters associated with the Phillips curve and associated with a lower wage rate, we get the result that capitalists or when capitalists have a stronger bargaining power compared to workers, then it is more easy for the central bank to control inflation. That is, that when workers have a lower bargaining power represented by a change in the parameters of the Phillips curve that led a higher reduce in the wage rate, we find that cycles become less volatile for a given MHB, or we find also that MHB, the critical value for the central bank, becomes higher, so the central bank has a larger space to control inflation. Well, and we find another relevant patterns, but I will skip that in order to gain time. Now, I will briefly present Model B. If we remember, Model A has the limit or the problem that it is assuming that savings and investments are equal. And we have to get to add the assumption that there is some time delay between savings used by the capitalist or obtained by the capitalist and then distributed to firms. In Model B, we try to overcome the problem by including the idea that we have the possibility to have financing investments through debt, and also we assume or we consider the effect of a non-zero excess demand. In this sense, we include a new variable, the capacity utilization rate, that can be adjusted, or in fact, it adjusts in response to excess demand. So here we include some mechanisms, some basic mechanism of adjustment proposed by that. And we recommend to compare this with the model of Sordi and Berselli, which is a model that presents a different way to adjust to the case of excess demand if you want some kind of variation of the model presented originally by King. Also, we include additional assumptions. For instance, we assume that the capacity utilization has a positive effect on the growth rate of productivity following the Caldor-Burton effect. Here we take as inspiration the work of Davila, Fernandez, and Sordi, 2019. Sorry, I have to include the year. And also, we assume that firms follow an investment function. So this investment function follows the canonical form presented by that, in the sense that investment depends on the profit rate and the capacity utilization rate. And well, since firms decide to follow an investment function, therefore they do not need to keep the equality between savings and investment, and therefore debt becomes relevant to finance investment. Okay, in addition, we keep the cash flow identity, and we include the idea that the interest rate not only depends on the response of the central bank to the perceived inflation gap, but also it can depend on the reaction of the rentiers when they find a higher leverage ratio. This assumption comes from the work of Keene, in the sense that when you have a higher leverage ratio, the rentiers can assume or feel there is a higher financial risk, so they will have incentives to increase the interest rate. Okay, so these are the formulations of the model. Again, I don't want to get into the detail. Just I will comment that we have a new state variable, the capacity utilization rate, and we have a 5-dimensional system. This system becomes truly complex, so you have the equilibrium value and some conditions for a positive equilibrium. But the most important thing, the model becomes truly complex. So instead of an analytical study, we present here some simulations, some numerical simulations of the model. And it is satisfactory to see that the model generates a dynamics limit cycles, stable limit cycles that are closely related to the model A. So we can say that at least the general dynamics of the model are close to the original version. So you have here all the numerical simulations we developed. And well, the relevant patterns are, of course, that we have more relevant patterns. I don't want to get into detail because I am past on the time. Just I want to say that between these relevant patterns, we identify, for instance, that when capitalists have a higher incentive to invest, represented by higher parameters of the investment function, the volatility of cycles tend to be lower. But at the same time, there is a trend to get a larger leverage ratio and a larger interest rate over the long run. So we find the possibility of debt crisis in the model. And also we find again that the distribution of bargaining power between workers and capitalists is relevant, this distribution, in order to get stable cycles. Okay, so finally, I present you also the idea that, well, even if we don't have the analytical proof that model B generates a stable equilibrium and stable limit cycles, we performed some analysis with a simplified version of the model. We get the analysis of the Jacobian matrix and the Hobbe bifurcation theorem for a 5-dimensional system with some simplifications, and we get that, in fact, the model is capable to get stable limit cycles in its simplified version. And also we get some cyclical dynamics which become complex. For instance, you have this dynamics. In this case, we find that when we simplify the model B and we try to different numbers for the numerical simulations, we began to identify the cycles that are not so smooth, but they have those, I don't know how to call them, maybe subcycles. And when we have these two-dimensional plots, two-dimensional parameter graphs, we can find, in fact, that you have cycles with some weird dynamics that maybe resemble some chaotic behavior of the model. Okay, and finally, to conclude, the model we present has the capability to recognize different stages or different financing regimes within the cycle. For instance, if we take the taxonomy presented by Minsky and reinterpreted by Foley and then by Meireles and Lima, it's possible to use the model to get some stages of the cycle when we have an edge financing regime, then stages when we have a speculative financing regime, and the stages of Ponzi financing regime. So the simulation of the model permits the identification of these financing regimes, at least in theoretical terms. Of course, we need to calibrate the model to some real data in order to see if, in fact, we can identify satisfactorily these financing regimes. No? So, as a conclusion, well, we have a model or two models that can represent the interaction between the finance and the distribution conflict, and we can generate from the models some stable limit cycles. We find relevant patterns. For instance, the conflict between workers and capitalists becomes relevant when the central bank has to control or has to achieve stability by controlling the interest rate, and so on. So these are the conclusions. And finally, for future research, in particular, we think that Model B requires a more analytical discussion. We present some preliminary results for the simplified version, but we don't have yet a clear idea that the model is capable to calibrate for real economies. So another future research can be associated with econometric estimations of the model and econometric identifications of the financing regimes associated with ideas of Minsky and other authors. So that's my presentation. Thank you. I don't know if we have some questions, maybe.
Thank you very much, John. Let me see if in YouTube. No, in YouTube there is nothing. I will have a question for you. It's like
Okay.
the first one. Well, two questions basically, because you mentioned for the Model A, I didn't understand if for the Model B was the same, that a low reaction to inflation of central banks would promote, or at least wouldn't promote instability. How do you define low reaction? Because right now we are increasing, right now in many countries, at least here in Europe too, we are increasing interest rates a lot. How do you define that?
Well, we define the reaction of the central bank just as a parameter that increases the interest rate when you have a positive inflationary gap. So you have a differential equation where the growth rate of the interest rate depends on the inflation gap, and M, the reaction of the central bank, is just an exogenous parameter. So it's a really simple behavioral equation.
Okay. Well, and the other one that is a little bit more related to my research, you mentioned that greater bargaining power of capitalists are related to a greater capacity of central banks to control inflation. Do you do that also with a parameter? It's like, because I didn't understand, the models were so huge that sometimes I get lost, not because of your presentation, just because the time. And I didn't understand if you did it through some kind of parameter, or how did you, if you can develop a little bit more about that.
Yes, sure. Well, in fact, it was the analysis of the bargaining power was in terms of parameters. We used a Phillips curve, where the money wage depends on the employment rate and inflation. So when the parameters of this Phillips curve increase, we assume that workers have a stronger bargaining power, so they can struggle for a higher money wage. And of course, the opposite is that when these parameters are lower, the Phillips curve will cause a lower increase or even a decrease on the money wage. So we represent the distributive power in that sense, in the sense of changes in the parameters of the Phillips curve that have an influence on the critical value of the reaction of the central bank.
Okay, okay. So thank you very much. It's like it was
Thank you.
just a curiosity.
No,
And
thank you.
I don't know. Let me see if there is any other question on YouTube. And if not, maybe we're gonna start with the last presentation. So, oh, archivo. I'm uploading. So, well, let me. So, well, if there isn't any other question, let's start with the last presentation, presented by myself again. And entitled like Regimes and Drivers in the Financialized Era, an analysis of European economies before and after the Great Recession. And I would like to start this presentation raising two questions. First, does financialization affect the macroeconomic functioning? And second, can financialization promote the appearance of different growth regimes? Well, these are the questions that I would like to analyze during the following sections of this presentation. First, it must be noted that a great number of economists over the last 2 decades has studied the implications of the growing role of the financial sector on different macroeconomic dimensions, like, for example, capital accumulation, income distribution, consumption, etc. In this regard, a popular debate has been the potential emergence of different financialized economies, finding in the literature mainly two approaches. The first one understands that financialization is characterized by some general tendencies, but the country-specific stances of these tendencies in each economy might promote the appearance of different growth regimes. The empirical strategy to identify these regimes will be to analyze the contributions to growth of each demand component, identifying therefore regimes like the export-led, debt-led, or domestic-led. On the other hand, we have authors that consider that this approach might be misleading, since the results might be wrong due to cyclical factors, in particular during economic recessions. Therefore, these authors, like Stockhammer, understand that it is a better strategy to analyze what he names as growth drivers. Understood like those factors that are not themselves part of the aggregate demand, but influence the growth of its components, like, for example, the financial cycle, the fiscal policy, or the external competitiveness. In the light of this open debate, the aim of this work is twofold. First, to develop some kind of theoretical framework to understand financialized economies, and second, to analyze uh, the emergence of different growth regimes in European economies and the role of growth drivers in it. Regarding the former, we understand the financialization as a transformation of the institutional framework of the economies, by which financial institutions and financial interests or motives get relevance in the operation of economies, altering the pattern of interactions of economic agents at the macroeconomic level and having therefore a series of effects. These effects, for example, is that some kind of growth drivers are more likely to emerge at the mesoeconomic level, depending also on the characteristics of each country and the configuration of different growth regimes at the macroeconomic level. Maybe we can see this a little bit more clearly in the illustration 2, how different growth drivers promoted by financialization, like a regressive distribution of income, the evolution of the financial cycle, the degree of intervention of the government or the price and non-price competitiveness affects different macroeconomic components of demand, like households, corporations, government expenditure, and net exports, and therefore determine the growth regime of the economy. Once we have developed this framework, we try to test it with reality. To do so, we try to identify the growth regimes for 20 European economies during 3 periods, before, during, and after the Great Recession, as well as its evolution. To this end, we use a hierarchical cluster technique to classify those economies which share a similar macroeconomic profile, and as indicators, those variables usually employed in economic literature, like different contributions to growth or financial balances. We find as results, we can observe in the following dendrogram that this analysis shows 4 main groups of economies that then we can label based on the macroeconomic properties of these economies. For example, first we find what we name as domestic-led economies that will represent in general terms the average economy. Then we may have the debt-led economies characterized by a great contribution to growth of households, corporations, government expenditure, but a very negative contribution to growth of the balance of goods and services, and a very negative financial balances of both households and corporations. And on the other hand, we have export-led economies, which are mainly characterized by a great contribution to growth of the balance of goods and services. Also, we have stagnated economies, which are those economies that during the Great Recession experienced a contraction of their GDP. As we can see, there are some economies that maintain the same growth regime, export-led, domestic-led, over time, but also there are others which experience important transformations. In particular, those economies which had adopted a debt-led regime before the economic crisis. Once the crisis started, most of them turned into stagnated economies and then moved towards domestic-led and export-led economies. Once we have analyzed we have classified the economies, we want to know which are the drivers behind the appearance of these regimes. To this end, we use a multinomial logistic regression using as dependent variable the categories the regimes already mentioned, and as explanatory variables, sorry for the presentation, as explanatory variables some proxy indicators of the growth drivers that we consider that financialization would have promoted. The preliminary results of this research are promising, since we find, for example, that a larger public expenditure reduces the likelihood of appearance of a debt-led regime or export-led regime in comparison to a domestic-led economy. But we also find that lower levels of price and non-price competitiveness and greater levels of companies' leverage increases the likelihood of appearance of a debt-led regime. And finally, we also find that a lower net property income distribution within firms reduces the likelihood of appearance of an export-led regime. Therefore, and to conclude this presentation, we can say that both approaches, growth drivers and growth regimes, can complement each other. That in Europe we can find at least 4 main typologies of growth regimes, but we can study a little bit more this, and that government intervention, companies' finance, and external competitiveness were important drivers for the appearance of these growth regimes in Europe during the last decades. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I open to any question in the chat or here. Thank you very much. Let me see if there is any question now. If there isn't any other question in the chat or here, maybe we can end the session. Thank you very much for your presentations, all the people who are watching us. Well, see you next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.